Hi, you're listening to Science Coast with Mallory Havens and
Chris White.
welcome. And today we're going to talk to you about what is the scientific method anyway. Chris, what is the scientific method?
Well, I think there's actually a little bit of controversy about that, and it's taught early on in grade school, traditionally as forming a hypothesis, and then coming up with an experimental method to test the hypothesis, and then to do your data collection, to analyze your data, and then decide whether the data supports your hypothesis, followed by a reformulation of the hypothesis based on the evidence collected.
Yeah, that's very elementary school, point by point. I think you just got an A in third grade.
Awesome.
I know.
I always had trouble in third grade, so I'm happy that I could pass it now.
Third grade was an interesting year for, I feel like a lot of people.
I think third grade is where I actually messed up my multiplication tables. I missed one day when they were explaining how to do multiplication, and then the next day I showed up and there was a quiz and I got every question wrong.
Did you do Mad Minutes?
Oh, I don't know what that is.
That's multiplication where you have like a whole page of multiplication problems and you only have 1 minute to...
Yes.
Oh, so stressful. Third grade.
Yes. 7 times 8. Could never remember what that one was.
Oh, I 8 times 7 is 56. Too bad there aren't any tricks. That's how I remembered it.
Man, I wish I'd known you when I was in third grade. Anyway, that's not what we're talking about, is it?
No.
Oh.
Scientific method.
Okay. Well, one of the concerns I've always had with the scientific method and this notion of forming a hypothesis is that I worry about the hypothesis biasing my data collection. And, if I have a vested interest, because I am a human, I have feelings, I don't want to be wrong. So if I think that the world works a certain way, then I might be biased to collect data which confirms my hypothesis. But that's not true then.
Do you think that there is at least the barrier that if you carry out a controlled experiment with the proper measurements, that even if you are biased, you're gonna get facts?
One that is what we're supposed to do, and that's what we're trained to do. But I know that in my field, experimental particle physics, there was still concern that the researchers who were doing the analysis needed to be blinded from the actual data itself so that they wouldn't try to manipulate the analysis to try to steer the answer in a particular direction. And it became quite common to implement methods by which the researcher doing the analysis wouldn't actually know what the answer was until they, quote unquote, opened the box. And that was always a big reveal. So you would test all of your analysis procedures, do all of your systematic studies, be all ready to go. And then there was this secret correction factor that only a couple of people knew who weren't doing the analysis that you would then apply at the very end to tell you what the actual answer was.
Yeah, we do. I still blind my students in experiments that we do with C. elegans or the small worms where they don't know what treatment is what plate. They just collect data for 21 days straight. And they know that some are purple and some are orange and some are A and B. And then at the end, when all the data is collected, we open up the key that we keep in a locked box that only one person knows who isn't collecting any data.
It's interesting because that just shows us that as humans, we are inclined to want to be correct. And so there is this confirmation bias that all of us have. And so as scientists, we have to be more objective. And I guess that's one of the challenges of being a scientist is that you truly have to be objective at all times.
Yeah, it's hard too because the whole thing with implicit bias that or just any kind of bias, it's often subconscious. So if you want something to be true, maybe you just poke those worms, you want to die a little harder or something that you're not doing it on purpose, but you aren't being maybe as gentle because you're like, these ones should be sick. And you don't think about it consciously, but that's why we blind ourselves. That's why often medical pharmaceutical studies are double blinded, where both the patient and the healthcare provider don't know what the patient's getting.
And then there's the reproducibility issue. I know that in my field, particle physics, you wouldn't trust a single measurement. There would always have to be some follow-up confirmation to show that an experiment with slightly different systematic uncertainties, for example, did come up with the same answer. And then it's like, okay,
Yeah.
now we can trust this.
I try to design 3 different experiments to say the same thing.
Yes. And then you have some confirmation that there just wasn't some outlying result that confused us.
Yeah. But sometimes I'll just take one. Just one working would be great sometimes.
Is this the frustration of a scientist?
Well, they say, like, if all of your experiments worked on the first go, your PhD would take 6 months, not 5 years.
Well, I think the other part about working on the PhD is learning how to do experiments.
And cope with failure.
Yeah, because it doesn't always work out. So it's interesting because now you have to figure out what the experiment should be. And so in order to do, you have to start with the hypothesis, and then from the hypothesis, develop an experimental method which might either prove or potentially even disprove. There are tons of experiments that I've been associated with that actually the attempt is to disprove something.
Right.
Because I think it's always hard to absolutely prove that something is true. It's easy to disprove something is true. You just demonstrate it.
Yeah. I think I've heard a lot that you should get more excited about your unexpected results because that's where really big discoveries can come from. Because if you already predicted the outcome successfully, then you're just confirming it. But if you get something totally wild and wacky, you might have found something really cool.
And I can give you a really good example of that. Back in the 1980s, there was this push to do proton decay experiments. And so there were all these really massive proton decay experiments to see if the proton, which we believe is stable, actually decayed into something else. And if so, what did it decay into? And that's what they were looking for. But in order to detect the proton decays, they had to exclude background sources. And the background sources were potentially coming from cosmic rays and neutrinos. And so the grad students were all told, go figure out how to pull out all of these background noise sources because we don't care about that. We're looking for proton decay. And the students, who were very bright, were looking at this noise in the data and said, actually, this stuff is really interesting. And the neutrinos are behaving in a way which we did not expect. And all of a sudden, the proton decay experiments became neutrino experiments.
Right. Yeah. That is exciting to have those discoveries that are like, wait a minute. I would say a lot of my PhD experimentally, I walked in with one question and I came away with a completely different set of answers that the first question was just flawed.
How did you come up with that first question to begin with?
Curiosity. So I was trying to establish that 2 different RNA species, they had to be in competition with one another. And I was trying to figure out how a cell decided to make one or the other, like what were the circumstances. And when I first tried to prove competition, I discovered that, wait, how can it do both all the time? And then basically discovered that there's like a bunch of different mechanisms to get the same result. So it just uses whatever pathway it needs to get the end product it wants so it can have both things exist simultaneously that I thought were mutually exclusive.
Wow. That's really interesting. And one of the things that I've always felt is true in my life is that I'm inspired by what other people say. So the best ideas I've ever had, if I've ever had any really good ideas, were often the result of having a conversation with another human. I know my wife and I often talk about how science is never done in a vacuum. It's really hard to be isolated. You're always being influenced by the people around you. And so many, in some sense, aha moments. I'm sitting literally at a cafeteria having lunch with somebody, and they're telling me about something that they're working on. And what they're telling me triggers this thought in my head, oh, that's how I solve this problem that I have over here.
Yeah.
And it isn't necessarily even direct. It's just, it stimulates me in a way that creates this really interesting idea that I never had, this thought that I had never had before.
Or you learn a new methodology that hasn't been used too commonly, because everything's changing all the time, right? People invent new technologies to look at old problems. And when you learn about some new like sequencing methodology, that's my field, then you can ask questions you wouldn't have been able to ask before and realize that, oh, I've been trying to solve this problem this way, but now that suddenly I learned this new technique, I can approach it from a different way and maybe get a really different answer.
So do you think that this interconnectivity that we have today with, the computers and online and people being able to talk to each other around the world at all times is creating a a lot of new ideas that never existed before? How does that influence the creation of science?
I think it might cause some new ideas to happen, but I also think they say there's no new movies anymore. There's just recycled plot lines.
Yeah, it's actually true.
Yeah. So sometimes I worry about that with science when there's so much information available that people are just trying to reinvent the wheel sometimes because having a unique thought in such a hyper-connected world can be hard.
Wait a minute. So having a unique thought, which is completely different. So what you're saying is that if enough people are talking, you kind of get carried along with the bandwagon.
Yeah.
And you lose perspective and you're not necessarily thinking orthogonally.
Yeah,
to
you're
come up with something.
part of the hive mind.
Oh my gosh. So what do we do?
Occasionally turn off your computer.
Beach vacation.
Oh, yeah, that's or hiking, mountain hiking.
Yes, that's good too. Good too. I'm picturing right now sitting on a beach or just standing somewhere where there's water with a pile of stones in my hand and just plopping them into the water.
Yeah. So taking mental breaks helps, but also maybe not being afraid to challenge existing ideas that other people have maybe really hung their hat on for a really long time and say, I don't know if I buy into this bandwagon. I'm going to hop off and look for something else.
Are you challenging orthodoxy?
I mean, I'm a bit of a lemming, but not too lemmoning-y.
It's good every now and then, especially if you're at an impasse. And if a particular field of study is kind of not making a lot of progress, then it is appropriate at that point to start challenging the orthodoxies.
Yep.
And maybe one of the foundational assumptions isn't actually correct and needs to be refined. And this is one of these, for example, with Newton. Newton's laws for physics explained classical motion, but then when people started doing detailed studies, they said it wasn't perfect. And that's where, relativity and Einstein and general relativity came in, and it's like, that's so much better. So just because a particular theory isn't perfect doesn't mean that it's wrong. It just needs to be more sophisticated than it was previously.
Sure, you don't have to throw the baby out with the bathwater.
And so, but I know that in the late 19th century, people were saying that all of the physics that there was had been discovered and there was nothing more. So maybe this is part of your, what you were talking about with the hyperconnected world, and everyone's focusing in a particular direction. And it's like, well, we already know everything that's here, but we have our blinders on.
I used to always joke about physics because, high school physics, I would say, who cares how a pendulum swings? Because
I'm not sure I have a response to that.
That was my initial foray into physics, where I was like, can you ask an interesting question? But you got to start with the fundamentals, of course.
I suppose. But that also is, coming up with a good question. So, and the experimental part is, what's the frustration? I think you were expressing some frustration earlier about, with your, coming up with a good experiment to try to answer it. And then the answer you get isn't anything like what you expected, and you have to go back to the drawing board.
Right. Which is exciting, I think, for me, but it's frustrating when you are trying to reach career goals that do not have infinite time to get to.
So I suppose, trying to circle back to the beginning about what is the scientific method, it's not as obvious or direct as we sometimes like to think. It can be circuitous. It can go in many different directions. It can have surprises. And in fact, the surprises are sometimes the most exciting part about the science, is when something happens that you just did not expect.
It's not linear. I think that's the confusing part to a lot of people, is they think of it as a linear process. And it's not, because you're constantly getting a result, changing your hypothesis, circling back. And people forget all the time, part of the scientific method is communicating your findings, because your findings don't matter if you don't share them.
And giving other people an opportunity to question what you've done and to possibly find, ways in which you can improve the science that you've done.
Right.
And I know that, in fact, it can be challenging when other people are saying, did you try this? Are you doing this? I'm not sure that you're doing this correctly.
Right.
And then having that strength to listen to what the other scientists are telling you, and to be better, because that's the whole point. The whole point of the scientific process is when we share our results is so that other people can critique them and we can be better and get better answers and better data and design better experiments, and in the process learn so much more really cool, exciting stuff.
Right. And stuff, and I've said before, to help people or to just rub particle physics in their face. I don't know what the goal is, but I think it's really important to share and communicate those findings because science is really cool and exciting. And I think sometimes there's a barrier where scientists aren't as good at communicating back to the lay population.
And it can be really, really messy.
Yeah. When you see those articles about real stories that just don't quite add up. So you've been listening to Science Coast with Mallory Havens and
Chris White.
Thanks for joining us. See you next time.
Thanks so much. Bye.